All right. I think
It says we are live.
We are
Okay.
live. Yeah. A few minutes late, but that's all right.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Do you want to start? Should I start?
greeting. Yeah, I'll start.
Good.
Greetings, Doug. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you, John?
It's a cold and actually snowy day here in Chicago. First one.
Not unusual
more
in
like-
Chicagoland.
Feels more like the end of November.
Yeah.
But yeah, happy to be inside. I'm good. I'm good. And what's new? And I know you're dealing with forest fires not far from you, so
Yeah.
or a forest fire, I should say. Hopefully, just one.
Hopefully, yeah. Well, we finally got rain after many months without it, which has been fun. But I mean, it's been beautiful days, but we do need the rain. This is one of the yeah. So anyway, today we have rain, which is very, very nice. So
yeah, and it's kind of the way the weather patterns have shifted so drastically.
Indeed.
And it isn't going to get any better, especially with the current administration. Or the
No.
soon-to-be current administration. So,
it certainly won't.
It's just dealing with I've been really good at avoiding the news, but still it's hard to avoid it completely. And
impossible to avoid it completely, but yeah.
So, anyway, today we are finishing up, on the last of the 5 aggregates. Consciousness, vijnana, what's your understanding of consciousness in this context?
I mean, I guess I have a lot to say about it. On the other hand, I don't have much to say. It's kind of weird.
Well, there's form and there's emptiness.
Yeah, right. That's a little bit of a later teaching, but yes. I mean, if you're talking from the point of view of early Buddhism, which is really where I tend to gravitate, consciousness is something that's relatively underdescribed. Basically, the Buddha says that there are 6 types of consciousness, one for each sense modality, and then the mind being the 6th.
Mm-hmm.
And that they arise and fall due to causes and conditions. So, you have contact with visible objects, and that causes the arising of visual consciousness. And then maybe the next moment, there's an arising of a sound, which causes the arising of auditory consciousness. And also, I mean, the other part that's important about consciousness in early Buddhism is that it's in a traditional understanding, it is the sort of important link between lifetimes. So it's this kind of it's the consciousness aggregate that seems to make the link between one life and the next life. That's sort of the way it's described in some of the formulas of dependent origination. So it sort of has those 2 important roles to play in early Buddhism. I mean, in later Buddhism, of course, it takes on a much bigger role, almost a central role in the Yogacara, as being sort of almost like the ground of being, of all things, as a kind of sort of a distributed consciousness that exists sort of as the ground of all existence. And in contemporary philosophy, which is something that I studied when I was in graduate school, consciousness is something that philosophers talk about quite a lot and trying to understand it. And there are various sort of interesting. I did a video about this a while ago, not too long ago. Interesting questions and conundrums having to do with what consciousness really is, and whether and how it can be integrated into a sort of a functional understanding of the sort of causal picture of human life. Because we think of the mind as being a sort of on the one hand, as kind of a functional object that, and in Buddhism as well as in contemporary understanding, as something that interacts with the world, that is affected by causes and conditions, and that then produces output, produces behavior. And so it sort of functions in this way. And we can understand consciousness sort of in that role as being some part of this sort of functional whole. But on the other hand, there's this aspect of consciousness that I think gets a lot of spiritual people interested, which is sort of like there's this aspect of it which seems to be somewhat outside of that causal nexus, which is just a kind of a way things are, a way things are that appear, and appearances, the internal subjective understanding of how things appear. That is,
Mhm.
there is a way it is to be me. There is a way it is to be you. And there is a way that red looks that blue doesn't look like that, which is somehow something that's separate from the sort of causal nexus, but is just a sort of a bare appearance. And the question for a lot of philosophers, and I think really going back a long, long time, but certainly nowadays it's very explicit, is how these two can be integrated, or whether they can be integrated, or whether there is anything to this other. Some philosophers say this way things appear is just kind of a unnecessary excrescence that we can sort of do away with and don't need. And others say it's the sort of central part of what makes us who we are. I mean, the Buddha didn't really talk about, of course, all this. These
Right.
are much more, I would say, sophisticated sort of philosophical kinds of ideas that he didn't really deal with. But
I mean, yeah, I mean, if we look at particularly in this particular teaching on the aggregates of clinging, it's like, where is the consciousness that is experiencing the seeing, the hearing, or whose is it, or what is it? And, is it me? Am I the, what, do I have any control over it? Not really. I can't not see something and not know that I'm seeing it. The question is, what is it that knows that's seeing it? Or, so in many ways, I've always kind of, I think that in my mind, the words, so we have consciousness, we have mindfulness, we have awareness, we have attention, and then we have, the ground of being, or we have Buddha nature, or if we put all these words on various aspects of experience, and a unified consciousness is one thing versus this mind that sees a form, identifies the form, and there's a consciousness that knows the form, and then there's the formations that name the form, and then there's the formations that create the stories around that form, and there's a consciousness of all that. So, and it's all happening so quickly that we don't actually even realize necessarily what's happening so quickly until we actually start to maybe inquire, right? And of course, this to some degree is the heart of insight. It's like, well, who's experiencing this? And is it a permanent thing that's happening? Is consciousness permanent? Is the form permanent? Is anything permanent? Is it always constantly moving and changing? And so, one of the ways it's often practiced, in other words, the language we use is really important as we practice. And especially in English and most Latin languages, I think, we always talk about, I'm experiencing this, I'm seeing this, I'm hearing this. But actually, is that really what's happening? Who's the I that's experiencing it? And when you drop those pronouns, that's a start of just kind of letting go of something, right? And then as we practice, and especially in meditation, when we can be very concentrated in the body, and the mind can be relatively still, and then of course there's a consciousness of that stillness, and then there's still an identity with the one who is conscious of the stillness, or there's an identifying with the one who is. And it's at that moment that, there's like another bit of inquiry that has to happen. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
really? Who?
Yeah.
Where?
I mean, I
what?
think that's you're pointing to something really important with consciousness, which is that of all the aggregates, it arguably might be the one that we tend to think of as our self the most.
Right.
And, I mean, this is something that in many philosophical and religious traditions, the self, the permanent self, is identified with this consciousness.
Right.
And, I mean, that's, I think, something that we all or people have tended to do over the millennia. It's also something that the Buddha himself explicitly rejected. That the Buddha explicitly rejected the idea that the consciousness is yourself. It's just as much a problem to identify consciousness as yourself as anything else. And part of that identification has to do with this tendency we have to think of the consciousness as being the same throughout, that there's this kind of unbroken line of consciousness that unites all moments of our experience and ourselves and our body and our everything into one whole. And indeed, in many religious traditions, that's the way it's explained. That's how it's understood. The Buddha was quite unique and original in denying that, and saying no, that the consciousness is always changing, just like everything else. That one moment it's ear consciousness, one moment it's eye consciousness, that these things are always in flux and depending on external conditions to come and go. So it's just as much a part of this, dependently originated flux of passing phenomena as anything else.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's really crucial.
Yeah. But like, even as you said earlier about, consciousness being the one thing that may be, transitory in the sense of going, being what is reborn. That's
Well, it's not
different.
literally reborn. It's
Right.
It's a causal kind of thing.
Right. Well, say more about that. Yeah.
I mean, there is a very famous sutta where I've forgotten the name of the sutta, but Sati, the fisherman's son, is the monk who says it's the very same consciousness that was in the last,
Right.
which is the next, and so it's literally reborn. And the Buddha takes great pains to say that no. So
I never said that.
Yeah, he never said that. So the idea is that it comes with this idea of dependent origination, that the consciousness in the new birth is dependently originated, it originates dependent upon the consciousness in the previous one. So there's a causal connection, but they're not literally the same consciousness, just as the consciousness in one moment in your own life is not literally the same as the consciousness in the next moment. So it's no different for the Buddha anyway, it's no different from any two moments within one lifetime. They're all dependently originated, coming and going, passing and being born at all moments. So it's not a different thing. I mean, I'm giving, of course, the traditional understanding here. As a secularist, I kind of, I'm not sure about all that, but that's at least how it's described by the Buddha. And we have to, I think, be correct about getting that straight. So, yeah.
Yeah, does lead to confusion for some. Because I'm also thinking about the consciousness element, the sixth element practice.
Yeah, which is not often described in the early texts. A couple of places it's mentioned as one of the elements, but
Yeah.
it's only a couple of places, and it may even be a back, it may come from the
Oh,
later
oh,
Abhidharmic
that's
tradition.
interesting.
I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look into that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, but it's again this notion of there's an awareness of something happening, an awareness of uh, how and how uh, things are sort of experienced on their own. Um, and what's so, it's interesting because if we think about experience, right? Okay, so consciousness is aware of me picking up this glass. At this moment, because I'm paying attention. But I could just as easily pick up the glass and not actually be conscious of the fact that I'm picking up the glass until after the fact. I realized, whoops. And consciousness was just aware. You may not have heard it. Consciousness was aware of the bell,
The bell,
the glass
yeah.
hitting the bell, right? And but consciousnness until after the fact was not aware that I had actually hit the bell with the glass. And so, it's there's really and then it's like I take credit for knowing, and that's the clinging,
Mm.
when it was just known, and things are known.
Yeah. I mean,
And
this is one of the, when you think about, for instance, the whole phenomenon, like of driving a car while you're listening to a podcast or talking to the person next to you. There is this definite, very close relationship between consciousness and attention, where you can be doing something very intentional in one sense, like driving a car and not hitting
hopefully,
pedestrians and
yeah,
so on, without any conscious noticing, with that,
right,
and this is one of the, I think one of the real conundrums about consciousness is, how there seem to be different levels of it that are all sort of going on at the same time. I think in the Abhidharma, this is understood to be explained by these sort of momentary, mind
moments,
moments, where
yeah,
one moment supposedly, there's this split second where you're conscious, let's say, of driving the car, and then there's a split second where you're conscious of the conversation going on, and it sort of oscillates back and forth between the two of them. But whether that's, and I have, putting on a sort of a contemporary psychology hat, I'm not sure whether that's really accurate, but certainly there's something got to be going on. It seems to me that there's probably different levels of consciousness in the brain, or in the mind, if you like, where we can be, in some sense. I mean, it's not a we, of course. A we is a construct, but that
right,
there's this continual idea, there's this continual consciousnesses sort of within the same mind stream that are at different sort of levels of awareness. It seems, at least that's from, from my own, I don't know, introspection of the feel of what it's like to drive a car while you're talking to somebody.
sure.
Um,
And we see it so often now because people are talking on the phone. I mean, hell, people are talking on the phone when they're riding their bicycles, or
yeah.
and yet we don't necessarily. Maybe we should, but we don't put that in the same league, say, as multitasking.
It is sort of a multitasking, but yeah.
In a way, but we're not conscious of it being
Yeah.
multitasking,
No.
and it's not exhausting necessarily, like multitasking is, and it doesn't necessarily get in the way of creativity, although it can, of course. But I mean, I'm just reflecting back. I was watching the first installment of Ken Burns's Leonardo last night, and so Leonardo was, he was not a schooled person. Everything he learned from nature, and it was just like as of course, one of the definitions of Dharma is basically, the nature of things,
Mm-hmm.
and and Leonardo was continually fascinated by the nature of things, and brought it into everything that he did. Um, and he talks about the senses in a particular way, and how the how one receives sight in particular, right? And then how that sight is taken into the brain, the core of the brain. And he was very rudimentary on one level in terms of neurologically, but he got it right, I suppose. But then there's still this question of who knew? I mean, what was being known? And of course, as he receives something, as he views a woman or a man who he's doing a portrait of, he's seeing much deeper than the physical being, and really also like illustrating the emotion that also is happening, and that's received by the viewer as well.
Yeah.
And so consciousness can be aware of so many, so much at once. It's even though it's happening theoretically, it's happening moment to moment. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a good illustration of the way that we can train. I mean, I don't know if, maybe we're training consciousness, but it's certainly we're training perception in the sense that an artist, I mean, I'm not an artist, but I've done a little bit of, that art when I was in school. And I do remember the experience even of, let's say, a few weeks of doing drawing classes, and the way that it changes subtly the way you look at the world, because all of a sudden you're seeing much more than you did before. And I'm
Right.
sure the same thing is absolutely true if you do music. You hear more. I mean, people who are trained in music theory can hear much, much more in a Mozart concerto than I can. I mean,
Sure.
And that's just, and that's a way that we can, there's much, much more available to us that we're not. I mean, you could say we're conscious of it, but just not aware of it. But I think we're not even conscious of it, really. And so we can train. And there's an interesting. People can try this out themselves. Unfortunately, I can't sort of do it on screen, but or I could do it on screen, but it's not going to come through on the podcast. In each of our eyes, we have an area of where there are actually there's no cones or rods in the retina of the eye. So there's
Right.
a blind spot in each of our eyes. You don't notice it. The only way to notice it is to close one of your eyes, but then you still won't notice it. You have to draw something and hold it up in front of your eye, and all of a sudden, if you draw like a dot on a piece of paper and hold it in the right place, the dot will disappear. It'll disappear because you've moved it into the right spot of your visual field where it's over the blind spot. And this is an absolutely fascinating example of the way that consciousness is constructed, just like everything else, because we're not conscious of there being a blind spot in each of our visual fields at all. I mean, you can close one eye, you're just absolutely not conscious of there being a blind part. But there is, and it's actually pretty big. And so the brain or the mind, or however you want to describe this, is sort of, some people say filling in the blind spot. It's not really filling it in. It's just not making us aware of it. We're just unaware of a lot of the character of our experience, and the character of our experience, of our conscious awareness, is that way constructed by the visual cortex, the brain, the mind. And it's, I mean, there are many, many examples of this.
Sure.
You can, with all these sort of, visual, what is the word I'm looking for? These
optical illusions.
Optical illusions, exactly. Yeah. Optical illusions, which, appear to us a certain way, like this line looks longer than that one, or this color looks like red. And
Right.
then, if you look at it more closely, it isn't, because
Yeah.
we're being fooled, because our conscious experience, our awareness is, again, a construct, which is, I think, one of the most fascinating things about
Yeah.
modern psychology.
And of course, that construct can be manipulated.
Absolutely, it can.
And I mean, my favorite one of just in terms of visual experiences is the famous count the number of times the basketball is tossed
Oh,
between.
yes, yes, yes. A
Right.
fascinating one. Yes.
And so you're concentrating on this, and you get through it, and then well, so how many times was it? And and did you notice the gorilla? And it's like astonishing how most people don't notice the gorilla.
I didn't notice
And
the
it's
gorilla.
just because, neither did I. And it's just because but this also relates to perception.
Yeah.
But but the perception in that case is, in a sense, manipulated in a way by consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that we're paying so close of an attention to what we've been asked to do, which is count the
Right.
number of times the ball is being tossed, that we absolutely miss something
Right.
enormous that's happening in front of our eyes.
Right. And that can happen. I mean, doesn't even, it can be something, you're intensely studying something, and, the fire alarm can go off and you may not even notice it because you're
Yeah.
so deep into it.
Mhm.
So that oral consciousness is no longer active because the other is so, and yet, if we bring it right back to the basic notion of the aggregates of clinging to self,
Hmm.
it's like, what is being conscious? Who is being conscious is conscious,
Right.
and it's fascinating. And, so as I think, as we practice in meditation, we can become hyper aware of it. And then when we take it into life, what happens?
Mm.
And I'm just thinking of something that happened yesterday. I was looking for a particular container, a bottle, in the kitchen. Heidi, my partner, had washed the dishes the night before, and I asked her where she put it. She said, well, it's either in the dish rack or the dishwasher. I didn't put it anywhere else. And it was not in neither of those places. And I was looking and looking and looking and looking. I couldn't find it. And I had looked in the sink a few times, at least in one part of the sink. I had a wash pan in the sink as well. And I, sort of looking and couldn't find it. This morning I go and, this morning or last night, I'm doing the dishes. And the jar was there the whole time in the corner of the sink that I hadn't, remembered to. I mean, it was like, and it's not even the sink is that big. It's just that I was looking in such specific places,
Yeah.
that I completely missed what was right in front of me.
I had the same experience, or a similar experience, looking for something in a drawer.
Right.
And it was a jar of something in a drawer. And I asked my wife, where is this thing? I looked in the drawer. She said, I'm sure it's in the drawer. And I said, no, I already looked. I looked like 3 times. And then
Right,
she went over to the drawer and it was right there. I mean,
Yeah.
It's like, what is, it's, how does that happen?
Yeah. We would label that as maybe absent-minded, or I don't know. I mean, it's just, we're so focused on one thing for whatever reason that we're not seeing the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so it's yeah. And so I think that, and yet there is also, I think what's interesting, like, just keeping it as real world examples, is how hard we can be on ourselves when we have been, when our consciousness seems to fail us. I was like, I missed that. It's like when I didn't see it, it's like, what an idiot. Like, I couldn't see it. It was right there the whole time.
Mhm.
And yet it's just the nature of consciousness. And it's, again, this sort of impermanent nature of it. and then if we sort of, feel like an idiot because we didn't see it, that's the identification with something that is really, I wouldn't say that it's beyond one's control, but when we are not fully present, perhaps, it feels like it's beyond our control.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know if
they're also
controls, that's the wrong word, but yeah.
yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
was gonna. There's very close, I think, relationship between consciousness and perception here. And we're sort of, I think,
Yeah, of
going back
course.
and forth between the two of
Yeah,
them, because
yeah,
perception in Buddhism is this idea of noticing and naming and identifying things in our environment, and we oftentimes misname or misidentify things. Um, and the question, I think, for many of us would be, and for me as well, is what is exactly the difference there between perception and consciousness? I mean, perception, I mean, in a certain sense, consciousness is the bare perceiving without an identification of any kind. But what is that? You know, yeah, I mean, again, yeah, there's a term in philosophy, the qualia or quale. The qualia of things are the qualitative feel of them that
mhm,
is uh, divorced from their identification as objects.
right, right.
So there's a qualitative feel or appearance of red that's different from the qualitative appearance of blue, or the qualitative feel of eating a pear that's different from the qualitative feel of eating a grape. Um, maybe that's that. Yeah, I mean
Well,
that's
yeah, I mean, so that there's the experience of it, the bare experience of it, and of course, the we rarely, we don't in meditation and in serious retreat practice, we can find ourselves in those places of simply bare experiencing and letting everything fall away, including the notion that I'm experiencing anything.
mhm.
What inevitably happens, though, is we see the color red and we identify with the red as a particular. Once we name it as red, are we actually experiencing the red, or are we just experiencing the memory of what red is and all the thoughts that go with that? And so, and of course, and this is where it all comes together. Like, oh, like, and they're constantly in flux and they're constantly changing and they're constantly, and the moment we grasp onto something, inevitably, it's going to change, and there will be some level of dukkha experience. And so, as we practice, it's just fascinating to, it's a fascinating map to use and
Yeah,
model to use. And,
mhm.
and we really sort of experience it so directly when we are really aware of it.
Yeah,
And so it's a big part of practice on, regardless of your tradition, because it's part of the later traditions too. It's just, expanded upon or elaborated in different ways. And so when we get into talking about, you know, consciousness as a unified field, that's an interesting, and we'll, we can talk about that another time because it's a big topic, of course. And while it doesn't find its way directly into the early teachings, as far as I know, there's a certain sense that the Buddha himself, uh, because he was so aware of his own past lives, and he could also be aware of others. And how is that possible? You know, so yeah, it's an interesting place of further podcasting.
Yeah, and I think all of these five aggregates that we've discussed is just a way that the Buddha had of he was very analytical of analyzing and separating out our experience,
Right.
our well, we might describe it as our phenomenal awareness into different types, and so to make us more perhaps curious and able to see more about the way that our phenomenal world, that the world around us, is separable into different types of experiences of the body, of volitions, of perceptions, of feelings, positive and negative, pains and pleasures, and of consciousness. And so, one of the things we can do, certainly one of the foundations of mindfulness, is to just pay attention to that and see these in our awareness.
Yeah. So I'm conscious now that my coffee cup is rather low. So I think it's a
Indeed.
good time to end the podcast today, and also remind people that it's your buying us coffee that supports the show.
Helps us defray
keeps the
costs
show
that we
going.
have.
And so we appreciate that support, and you can go to diggingthedharma.com to buy us some coffee, which is such a clever way of supporting shows, I think, and
or become a member if you'd like, which is a
yeah,
nice thing to do.
and leave some comments. So
Comments and
you
questions
can
always.
leave comments on YouTube, or you can leave comments on our website, either place. We
Mhm.
get them eventually. And yeah, and in the meantime, keep digging the Dharma, and
Keep digging the
we'll see you
Dharma.
next time.
Thanks, Jon.
Take care.